We're going to start?
Let's start.
Well, this is about buildings and cities. I'm George Gingell.
I'm Luke Jones.
And we are sitting here with a salacious-looking building in front of us that may or may not have much Gaudí influence.
We're going to talk about primarily churches, but we've actually got one extremely profane project before we get on to those.
What are you suggesting it seems like? Surely it must be a jelly mould.
A jelly mould, yes. Very tall, very...
bulbous.
Yes, maze, corncobbish. The hotel attraction is a kind of mythic Gaudí project from 1908, all trace of which actually I think vanished in the fire and destruction of the burning and destruction of his studio in the Sagrada Familia in the 1930s. So the drawings which exist of it were reconstructed from memory by people who'd worked on it 40 or more years previously after the Second World War.
Yeah, also 40 or so years into his mythologization.
It's a pretty crazy project. I mean, I guess we just have to sort of take it at face value. It's a proposal for a hotel for Manhattan. I mean, the term hotel seems a little bit strange because it doesn't, as far as I can tell, involve any sleeping accommodation.
For me, I would say this is something that feels a bit like the Doric column by Los. Los's Chicago program,
Chicago Tribune,
which is that you've got an idea for a form.
Yeah.
And at this point, this is a kind of the culmination of something we'll be talking about later in the episode, which is Gaudí's experiments with this particular form of like cone geometry, tall cone geometry. And then I think he's just thinking, what can I do with this form of geometry? I could do a skyscraper and it could be a hotel. So
the client was a man called Edward T. Carleton, who sounds a little bit like one of the inhabitants of Franz Kafka's America. I mean, I think it was much more of the emphasis was on the attraction. It was going to have enormous meeting halls, exhibition halls, dining rooms, restaurants, some apartments, apparently.
Which makes sense, because that's actually kind of what Gaudí buildings have ended up being.
Yeah. Well, yeah, very
essentially,
much so.
Almost exclusively.
Very much so. So, yeah, there's no way you can possibly read any of the captions on the drawing we're looking
I can get a sense of something, and I'm not sure if this is totally right. I get a sense that this is a big dome, very tall dome, one of these hyperbolic, rotated parabola. I don't really understand how a dome is hyperbolic other than it's like a hyperbolic curve that's been rotated. And the inside is hollow.
Yeah.
And it's got a skin of accommodation, and then at a certain point a deck goes across and you have like a giant room. And there's presumably a cluster of them, a bit like a chunk of the Sagrada Familia.
Yeah.
But like taller. A bit, but is it taller than Sagrada Familia? More like tower-like.
Yeah, so they say that it was meant to be about 1,000 feet high, so that's 300 and something meters. So that is taller than Sagrada Familia by some distance.
Yeah, how big is the Sagrada Familia? I feel like it's quite tall. It's probably the tallest building in Barcelona, right?
Yeah, it's going to be the tallest church in the world when they finally put the enormous Jesus on the top.
It's a project that almost doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's fascinating because... it's a Gaudí take on like an extremely un-Gaudí building type, like in a completely different type of city.
Yeah,
I mean, like he designed he designed like a little bar. He designed like a little bit of entertainment stuff. He obviously designed some kind of exhibition festival stuff right at the beginning of his career, but
we don't really see a take on.
Yeah.
I would say in the representations we see of this project, it really is like an application of a set of geometries, which feels very early noughties to a skyscraper. Yeah. And then you just get someone else to fill in the
floor plates. Yes, yes, stack them on the inside. Yeah, it seems to have. There seems to be this kind of sky. What is it? There's a kind of mini Sagrada Familia on. About
Guardian cross sort of thing.
Kind of about 2/3 of the way up. Kind of like a mega sky lobby, like if your sky lobby was about 50 meters high or something.
This inhabited section feels like the inhabited section of the Palace of the Soviets as well. It really is like huge space. Yeah. Put some big rooms in it and some small rooms in it. Job done.
Be some things here, yeah. Someone's done a render. There's which is kind of kind of fun.
I don't believe it.
It doesn't.
As in, I don't think that's what a Gaudí skyscraper would have looked like.
No, the thing it looks most like is what's that big pyramid skyscraper in San Francisco?
I thought you were going to say Pyongyang. Oh,
Yeah.
I know what you mean. Like like the pyramids. I guess it looks
It's got a bit of that
It does
kind of
look more
texture,
like that
yeah.
than the Pyongyang one. And actually a bit like that skyscraper in Barcelona, except that it's not covered in like bluey green glass.
Oh yeah, the Nouvelle one. Yeah.
Yeah,
Which
is pretty undistinguished.
also has a weird relationship with scale. That building is much smaller than
It's
it first
shorter
seems.
than the church.
Yeah, much smaller than it first seems.
I mean, it's a little oddity to get us going, right?
Yes.
It's a nice kind of like this is a capriccio, right?
Yeah,
It's a caprice of what Gaudí would have been like if he had
gone to America.
Yeah. and like, you know, done
If he'd got over all the, all his hang-ups.
I don't think he knew anything about America, but neither do I, so...
No, I mean, I think he had some kind of Howard Rorkean characteristics as a personality. So
well,
I could imagine.
megalomaniac builder is almost a job description
famously,
for the people we talk about,
well,
right?
yeah, very intransigent as well.
Part of the thing that makes this seem so fantastical is that he didn't build it. I think Gaudi's buildings seem... When, like, the Sagrada Familia, which we will talk about possibly at the end of this episode, although whether we'll get there or not, we'll find out.
Yeah.
In its ambition and style, seems like a sort of ridiculous, impossible building to build. As in, it seems like a project which shouldn't have got off the ground. It should just have been those models, and everyone should be like, wouldn't it be cool if they'd done that, just like a space elevator or...
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Whatever. But the interesting thing about that one is they are doing it.
They are actually building it. Yeah.
And we get to see the consequences of that.
I think we should get our heads into religion. So he did, there are like, just to warm up, there are a couple of smaller projects. He did a kind of little sculptural setting at Montserrat, which I haven't been to, found it quite hard to find photos of. This is a picture that I found. It seems to be a setting of kind of some sculptures of mourning around the tomb of Christ, I think, set into a natural cave.
Dali broke her toe visiting this a long time ago.
Oh, really?
That's the only thing I can really because I haven't been there.
Right, moving on.
Well, the thing with that is it's got one of his features, which is it is a thing in nature, but in this case, it's carved from the living rock of Montserrat, the holy mountain.
And then the other one is that he did works over a number of years, as a intervention into the existing Gothic cathedral in Palma, Mallorca. A lot of these Gothic churches in Spain have choir as a kind of almost sealed box sitting in the middle of the plan.
Yeah, like a ship.
Yeah.
Kind of a boat in the middle of the church.
And they still have them in like Granada or in Seville. I mean, the intervention, they got rid of it. So the thing which he does is something which feels kind of vaguely banal in the context of what cathedrals are like in this country, where they've all been opened up like that, and you can always go in one end and see all the way to the other.
Yes.
But in this context, it's sort of slightly more...
This feels like
less usual to do that.
It feels like the big moves are church modernisation.
Yeah.
Where he's opened the whole space up to make it big and tall. Big, particularly. He opened up a series of closed up windows.
Yeah.
He introduced a lot of stained glass.
Yeah.
And then there are several decorative... Oh, he removed the non-Gothic covering of the 18th century Baroque covering of the Gothic altar.
Yeah.
Make it more Gothic. And then he did significant decorative works to the end, the holy end, which had a screen of sort of gilded lily leaves going up.
Yeah.
Which looks very attractive. And he did the design and a maquette that's still in there now of a kind of giant hanging lantern baldacchino in the middle over the altar.
Yeah.
Which is full of sort of like grasses and flowers. So it's like one of these huge Gothic lanterns with lots of glass lanterns hanging from it. And then the top is made of kind of a thin like ribbon of like brass meadow. But it's made of like papier-mâché, and it was meant to be the temporary one. And then they put a stop to his works because I think people were concerned he was going too far, and because there was the bishop had died and there was political dispute within the administration of the cathedral, which is something which can happen from time to time.
But there is a sort of, as you say, there's like a vision for reforming the church service, and particularly it's kind of important that he's putting the laity, the congregation, in as a mass in the middle of the church, and there's a kind of vision of like filling the church with lots and lots of happy, faithful, celebratory Catholics, which is it's very much the sort of vision that he's also in pursuit of in the Sagrada Familia on a much larger scale.
The kind of gross architectural moves are about making it big and open, but also doing things to kind of create interest in the depth of field to make it seem bigger.
Yeah.
So this big lantern kind of like makes the depth, it affects the way you perceive the depth anyway, as I think would have opening up the windows more. It already, I don't know, this cathedral has a massive rose window which casts, it doesn't have, it's Gothic, but it doesn't have as much glass as you would get in a similar period church around here or in France, I guess because it's hot. But it does have this huge rose window that casts this coloured shadow, coloured like beam of light that kind of moves around the church. So I think we've got some elements that we'll see in the Sagrada Familia, but you wouldn't go in there and think, oh yeah, this is really Gaudí, this cathedral. It's very much still a Gothic cathedral.
Yeah.
I think in the way you would experience it.
Good.
So he was doing that for quite a few years, right?
What was...
7 years, something like that.
Yeah. And there was also, I mean, significantly, he had a period of illness in, I think, 1909, which was quite serious and where he basically wasn't working for the best part of a year, which I think that it was brucellosis caught from milk because he was on this horrible diet where he was eating an enormous amount of lettuce dipped in milk. He had, I think we kind of made reference to it, he had like real hang-ups around food and had this... He had very strange food hang-ups. It's one of the things I've got from the biography. He was... Yeah. He ate very strange stuff.
Care to elaborate?
So he had a diet of almost exclusively vegetables, with like maybe some olive oil. He would eat, but actually he was kind of a bit anorexic, maybe also maybe certainly like what you would now call kind of orthorexic. He had like extremely strict self-imposed rules about what he could and couldn't eat, and so yeah, and he tended to so this thing where he was just eating for a period. He was just eating lettuce dipped in milk, along with almond biscuits or something like that.
Cool.
Very.
That seems like a maniac.
Which yeah, and eventually he caught this special disease that you get from bad milk called brucellosis, which is a kind of chronic bacterial infection that does all sorts of things to you.
How unfortunate.
Yeah, then he was out of action for quite a long time.
That's a shame because that was kind of near the end of like when any of his projects were working. Apart from the Sagrada Familia.
Yeah. So I think that came. Yeah. Well, I think at that point, really, the only projects he had on were after he came back. The only projects he had on were these two we're going to talk about, the two churches.
Had Park Güell down tools?
Oh, maybe Park Güell was still going along. Actually, no, you're probably.
I feel like everything ended at the beginning of the First World War, apart from, which wasn't really to do with it. It was to do with Güell stopping sponsoring him.
Well, shall we talk about the Colonia Güell and the Colonia Güell Church?
Well, do you want to outline what the Colonia Güell is?
So the Colonia Güell was a planned suburb, and it's a kind which was built by the Güell family. It's an industrial site called Santa Coloma. But essentially, you have these bouts of like unrest in the city, and during an earlier one, they'd moved a lot of the factories out of the city to this place, so there were a lot of workers around, and he kind of took
just outside Barcelona to the west.
Yeah,
but there would have been a bit of clean countryside between before.
Yeah, I mean, kind of inspired by these sorts of planned towns which had been built by progressive industrialists throughout the 19th century. He kind of wanted to do one for his own workers, and obviously as part of that you had to have a church. So they did also build a whole lot of, I think I've got a little map of it. They built housing.
There's a school.
Yeah, it's not
a fancy master's house.
I mean, rather as with the Parkwell, that they don't look like they've built nearly enough for what you would actually need for the mass workforce of an going industrial concern.
No, but there's a lot more built here than Parkwell.
Yeah, obviously.
Much more.
Yeah, a lot more. But still,
it's something that is it's predominantly pretty utilitarian buildings.
Yeah, though with some little. I don't have pictures. There's some little sort of brick, slightly, kind of Andalusian Moorish sort of details and things.
Yeah, like there are some buildings that look interesting, but there's nothing nearly as interesting as the church, which seems like a really fascinating project that you can kind of see the kind of initializing moment for the last flourish of Gaudi's design, or the last Gaudi period, which is this period of like 3D geometry of a particular sort, making these like domed rocky masses.
Yeah.
With a complicated geometry that is not at all either especially like biomorphic, although there's still some elements of that, but it's not at all Gothic.
No.
Whereas, or kind of, it's really completely breaking free from the conventions of like type and like building element and things like that. This last style, and we'll see where it's kind of coming from with this church, is a style in which there are no verticals, which is extraordinary.
Yeah.
I can't think of an architect before this who's designing buildings with no vertical elements.
No.
I mean, obviously there are many examples from vernacular architectures.
Yeah.
But not... and I may just be missing something.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about it really deeply, but it seems like a really shocking thing and something that was not at all typical. And I think it like bears emphasizing... I think this project is one of the most extraordinarily divergent and curious projects out there.
Yeah,
of this period.
It's an amazing proposal, and it's the product of an equally extraordinary design process, which is one of the most sort of fascinating and enjoyable. I mean, I think we should just get into it. So the project, it's a kind of a magic mountain, the church, in its sort of ultimate conception. It's this sort of spiraling mass. So there's a kind of lower spiral where the ground comes above the crypt and creates an entrance into the church itself. And then the body of the church itself is a sort of, slightly kind of spiraling mass. And then there's a kind of main tower.
And it's sort of something which is not... I suppose in plan it's kind of somewhere between kind of a like inflated oval but it's made in terms of its silhouette of a series of different of these tall skinny domes that we've seen in other projects, sometimes fused together, sometimes wider, sometimes taller, with a central pinnacle spire, which itself is built on an undulating landscape, which is made of kind of like irregular, asymmetrical fingers of structure coming down, supporting a built landscape, it feels very... The ambitions of this project in some ways feel like the beginning days of computer architecture. We've got a continuous surface that starts as the ground, is a roof, never flat, is a floor, and the same thing as a floor and a roof, and an outside and an inside, and like a continuation of the earth sort of spiraling round, and then this completely this massing which is built of all these irregular elements with a single geometry. Very curious.
So it was and I mean it was developed as a hanging model. So I mean at various points we've talked about this form of the catenary, which is an arch, which is the inversion of a hanging rope or a hanging chain. There's a sort of idea that through gravity you can obviously model upside down the lines of force that would run through a structure. Like, he'd learned as a student this technique called graphic statics, which is a way of it was a technique, as it was taught to him, of designing kind of like flying buttresses and like Gothic vaults and things. Which is I don't fully understand what it's doing. It's a way of sort of graphing the.
Well, I think it's just the way of like using geometry to construct the force lines. I mean, I think of graphic statics as being something you do on a drawing desk.
Yeah.
Where you just kind of plot the two things against each other, and then you it's basically understanding how the equation of the loading produces a curve.
Yeah. So the way of modelling simultaneously.
And obviously that's a static.
Yeah.
Load, so it's not, the actual loads of a building will encounter lots of things. I guess wind, and they're not, which are not completely static. With this model, you can use geometry to fairly straightforwardly model weight, the movement of weight through a curve, particularly when basically what you're designing is an arch.
So the model, it's this enormous hanging model, which from the photo you can see was about, I don't know, 5 or 6 meters high, and I think was 1 to 10 in scale formally, and then it also modelled the masses of the building at a different scale, I think at 1 to 10,000.
That would make sense, because you would the masses you would cube.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and so the mass, obviously, if you imagine, an arch or something like that. If there is a lot of mass in the middle, that will sort of change the natural force line of the arch. And if there's a lot of mass like placed asymmetrically over one side of it, that will move the natural shape of the arch sort of over a bit, so that it will be pointing more one way than the other. And essentially that's what's being modelled with these little bags full of lead shot, which are modelling all of the weights of the building at scale.
I have a whole load of questions about this. So this church was designed for quite a while, like 6 years or something.
Yeah.
Before it went on site.
I think it was it was kind of commissioned around the turn of the century, and then they started on site in 1908.
So they spent 8 years developing this plan. We don't have anything like as much as with every project. Nearly everything is destroyed.
Yeah.
All his drawings were destroyed. Just things that like left the studio survived.
Yeah, they published a book about it in the 20s or 30s, and that's where all of the existing images have come from.
And it's really difficult to understand there's a few things. Like, it's really difficult to understand how the design method works.
Yeah.
So like when he's actually, I don't believe you could, it seems like a way where you couldn't kind of like design, like I want to do the massings of this church. I guess you could literally like have like hooks or something where you're moving things around. But in terms of like, it seems like a very difficult way of like setting out how you want something to be designed rather than setting out the solution to the problems of loading.
Yeah. It feels obvious to me that they would have developed this through a series of much smaller versions using the same technique.
And I also think he must have used other methods.
Yeah.
So there's obviously a process by which you can create this like hanging model. I'm not totally sure what it's modelling, because sure, you can like, okay, we're going to produce these force lines through a thing, but most of the load in the building is like a shell of masonry with columns on the inside. But I think the masonry and the columns are load bearing. How you would use like the initial story of how you would use like chains and weights to represent structure seems like very simple and clear. And then how you would actually represent the structure of a building like this, which has lots of shapes in it which just don't seem like they're following force lines to me in reality, and we can talk about what they are later. But like there's lots of things which are like the underneath surfaces which kind of bulge towards you, like if you can imagine something hanging on struts or something. That's not a shape designed for like maximum efficiency. It's designed for its kind of aesthetic potential. And like I don't think it'd be impossible to kind of model a wall and a column just with systems of chains and weights, but it doesn't seem to me like totally intuitive that it's like this like simple parametric model that just like produces the building.
No.
It seems to me like part of a much more complicated design process that because we've been left very few pieces of information. We've got like the state of the building, which is not at all finished, some photographs of paint overs of photographs of the model, and photographs of the model, and we're kind of left to like imagine that that's the process. But it seems like he must have been using a lot of other tools to develop this like really complex design.
I guess that the purpose of doing such a big model is that it does allow you to get the geometry of these kind of leaning elements to simulate it quite accurately, or to simulate it to a high degree of detail.
Yeah.
I guess that would have been useful.
Oh no, I'm absolutely certain that this model was doing a lot of calculative work. I don't doubt that for a second. I'm not like saying this is bogus at all. I'm just saying that like I think there's like large bits of the story missing.
Yeah.
On how this was actually used. It's like we've got like this tiny amount of information and we just kind of like draw a straight line through it.
There's
he clearly is becoming very interested in this hanging dome form.
Yeah.
We've had this tall dome before. It's there right at the beginning with, well, not right at the beginning, but very early in
Palau
Güell, this tall dome shape. And he's becoming more interested in like its geometric properties.
Yeah.
Like this is 25 years later.
Yeah.
And has got this opportunity to develop something that's really a much bolder vision for architecture. It's like in there it's something really predictable. Well, not predictable, but it's like applying unusual geometry to a completely normal element, which is like a tall hall in a building.
But it's kind of stuck on, isn't it?
It's kind of stuck on, and it's like not doing all these other things. And it's like he's become... This is that geometry being combined in a really complicated way to make up a building.
Yeah. So a lot of the images that we have, that like... This is one of the great sort of... it's like a great mystery story as well, you know. What really was this model? What did it look like? How was it really made? And a series of people in the post-war period have gone about trying to reconstruct, well, first to kind of reconstruct the building itself, which again, this was led by one of his former workers. But then there's also been a series of other people who've worked on it. And I think we talked about it in the bonus. This book from the Institute of Lightweight Structures is all about their reconstruction of the model, which I think is still the largest one that anyone's done. It's not quite the same scale. I think theirs is 1:20 rather than 1:10.
Do you want to describe what the model looks like?
I mean, so the original one looks like an enormous...
Or like we can describe the photograph that we see, really.
Yeah.
Like this classic photograph.
It's this
because
huge...
I'm aware that like we're thinking about this really unusual building and not really being able to describe it super well so far.
It looks most like a kind of strange tree. There is a structure of rope and sackcloth that's hanging in the middle of the space. This is a photograph taken, it seems, from a platform or a mezzanine of some kind, looking down into a very tall studio space. And what you're looking at is this thing which looks like a kind of a tree or maybe a goblet, kind of simulated in sailcloth and rope, with a mirror underneath it right at the bottom. And then it has hanging from it this cloud of little decorations, which are these little bags of shot, which are simulating the load and which are kind of pulling various bits of it a little bit more taut. And you can just about tell, looking at the model, which it's quite a mysterious thing. You can sort of tell which bit is which. You can see that is the ramp which goes up above the crypt.
Yeah.
And goes around into the entrance, and that's obviously this central tower poking out the bottom.
The cloth doesn't at all make like a finished surface. It really is like hung sheets and all ruffled and like you don't see the masses of the like spires and things emerging very clearly at all. And it's absolutely covered in these little tiny shot bags, and it's huge and photographed from strange angles, so you don't get a sense of the mass of the building that clearly at all.
No, they look like
I mean, I've had a few thoughts. Like, if you move the distance apart of these, like, strings, for example, you've got more material between them.
Yeah.
So the weight in the shot bags has to be recalculated by another process.
Yeah.
And presumably the only way you work out the weights to fill these bags is you have a drawing and calculate the amount of material above it?
Yeah, I don't know. Unless you can get a cloth which is exactly 1/1000th of the weight of...
But we know it's not doing that. It's because it's using bags of shot, which have got exact numbers of shot balls in them.
Yeah.
As a parametric model, I can sort of see how it like makes the lines, but it's not a simple and clear and obvious tool. No one's ever done this afterwards for any other project, and I can think of a load of reasons why.
The process which is kind of presented for how it was used is that there were photographs of the model.
Yeah, that when you take the cloth away, the model looks so much cooler.
Yeah. Yeah, which is what they did in the Institute of Lightweight Structures model. And then, and they also created these kind of reconstructions where they kind of present, as it's understood, the relationship between one and the other, the way that this structure of strings and shot bags kind of leads to, the overall form of the church, which is very bizarre.
I think it's worth like us describing what we see in their
Yeah.
drawings, because their drawings are a lot clearer. I'm not certain if they're... I mean, they're probably right. They're very smart people.
Yeah.
But, like, they're not from Gaudí, so we can't, like...
Yeah.
Like, this is an interpretation. But what they feel like is you've got, like, something which is sort of the bottom of a steep cone, the edge of which sort of frill, like a sea snail or something.
Yeah.
And then that's got a kind of... wrap round it, there's this ramp, which is a different landscape, which kind of takes between this landscape of columns at the front, which goes into a crypt underneath, and then is the base of a ramp on the top. And then that kind of becomes a frill, like the edge of a... Like you could imagine the whole thing being a giant sort of sea snail or something. And then the body is something which is a mixture of merged towers of these cones and a continuous surface. At times it's walls, at times it's at these towers. I think this drawing probably makes it look more like it's merged just because they have to draw... It's like a line drawing, and they've just got to choose where they determine a geometry is sufficiently curved that you draw a line down it.
Yeah.
And then it's got a kind of sawtooth top, which is the tops of all these towers, with lots and lots of windows in the main body. You're just going to have to look it up if you actually want to know what it looks like.
Yeah, I do. I think their drawings are really great. There's an axo of it where... I mean, what does it even look like? It looks like a complete fantasy. It's this kind of... It's like masonry as a series of kind of concentric curtains with these openings all over the place on no particular pattern. Kind of... Well, sometimes they seem to have a little bit of a grid going, but they're also actually sort of irregular. And then there's a series of domes on the top. There are all of these different little towers on the top.
Do you think those grids of windows are like realizations of like almost that hatching in the paint over?
Yeah.
Like, where is that
coming from? Yeah.
Like...
Who knows? Yeah, it's not the way it would have turned out, I guess. And they've done a really nice exercise, which is to try to find, in the bits of the church which were constructed, to find their equivalent moments in the reconstructed model. So these sort of branching columns in the crypt, which are you can see are produced by these sort of moments where a series of... Well, how do you even describe what's going on? There's a kind of a network of strings which are simulating a vault, and then they're pulled together from two different places to create a kind of Y-shaped column that's propping up the vault in two different places.
But it's they're very complicated. They're geometrically very complicated because the columns aren't like... At no point does the column have like a section that's the same in two places. Like... Yeah. As in like, you know, a normal column, you could imagine it's a cylinder and it goes all the way up, and if you cut a slice through it at any point, it's a circle. If you cut a slice through this column, at any 2 points are different.
Yeah.
It has sort of flat surfaces which kind of curve and twist
Yeah.
It's sort of it's sort of prismatic and splits and gets thinner, and then it's going out into sort of like set of ribs, like spandreling out, but which have cross bracing, but each joint is irregular. No two things the same. It also doesn't have like an exact relationship with the photograph, or like, you know, like if you could see those two things, you could say these sort of look similar, but it's not like
they're not completely identical.
You know, these look slightly like, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Or there's some, you know, these kinds of windows. You know, well, the same is true. So these kind of windows in the as-built wall, in a way, the way that he's actually chosen to build them kind of emphasizes the opposite of the actual kind of force line geometry.
Yeah, this is part of my thinking. Part of my thinking is that like people really want to emphasize naturally will emphasize this thing as a like parametric solution to the structure.
Yeah.
But to quite a great extent, I think it's like also a geometry creator. And same with like the convex like ceiling surfaces at points.
Yeah.
I think it's like sometimes the geometry is the right way up and sometimes it's the wrong way up because he liked the way it looked.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, if you're making a hole in a wall, you can kind of do it like it's quite achievable. So, for example, these windows we're talking about here, they are like teardrop shaped.
Yeah.
And in the model, it seems that the arch, the bottom of the teardrop is at the top, like it's an arch.
Yeah.
Which then comes to a point at the bottom.
At the bottom, yeah.
But in the building, the point is at the top and the arch is hanging.
Yeah. Which you can just, you know, you can do that.
Yeah, like that's a perfectly fine structural solution because obviously, like it's like a pointed arch on top of a window. And I agree. I think it like really disrupts the building a lot.
Yeah.
Like they suddenly become really like this strange biomorphic thing.
Yeah.
And it's really crazy.
I mean, the thing is that as presented, this is a kind of project beyond drawing, or kind of without drawing, because what you have is the parametric model, and then the presentation drawings of the church are, as you say, these paint overs. So what he did was to take photographs of the model and to paint over them, like making them look a bit more like a real building, adding a little bit of, I mean, actually adding like a lot of mysterious kind of shading, but maybe a little bit of ornamental elaboration and detail.
Yeah, there's not much there.
Some little. I mean, in terms of ornament, it's mostly like sticking sculptures on top of the towers. Actually, I would say is the main thing. Or
that's kind of not what I mean by. I mean, actually, at the level of sort of surface detail, if you kind of took the glasses off and tried to fill in the blanks, you'd think there was tons there. You'd think the whole thing was made of like chocolate ganache, and every surface was like peppered with detail, and it was kind of like, and it kind of the bits that are built are like that.
Yeah.
But there's not much there. As in, if you try to trace a line drawing of that to get the actual information out, he hasn't really drawn. It's kind of shading.
Yeah.
It's kind of shading and shadow and inference, but it's not like clear.
Yeah. I guess it's, as you say, structurally, geometrically, in terms of what the various elements of the building do, it's extremely daring and strange. And, you know, in the context of what architecture had been through most of the 19th century, it's like a profound break. You know, the ideology of a lot of architecture in the 19th century is that it's sort of ruled by the plan and secondarily by, you know, other two-dimensional orthographic drawings. It's kind of an axiom of the way that drawing is taught, is that you can represent any three-dimensional object through descriptive geometry, you know, your three projections and, you know, sort of setting it up right. And obviously you sort of can on this, but it's about the most difficult thing that you can imagine representing in a two-dimensional way, because it would require such a kind of level of how many drawings would you have to do of those columns in order to like represent all of the things which is going on in them, or in the you know, the surfaces of this kind of building.
I mean, people did do, like, engineers do complicated things.
Yeah.
I forget how many tons of drawings it is to spec a Concorde, but it's like you can't put it in a van because it's too heavy.
Yeah.
And they spent 8 years drawing, working this thing up.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, if I thought someone had spent 8 years on this, I think, why isn't it a bit more developed?
Yeah.
Like, they've gone on site. I don't believe it, actually. Like, I don't believe they went on site literally with what we've got.
They probably had a bit more.
I think there must be more that was gone. Because you couldn't have gone on site with this.
I wonder.
I know people were like very...
They were willing to try things.
They must have had a plan.
In a way
Otherwise, where did they know where to put?
Yeah. They
like,
must...
okay, so the model was hanging there.
Yeah.
It was on site, so it wasn't completely insane. They could take measurements from the model.
Yeah.
And sort of start from that. I might be completely wrong. This is all supposition.
Yeah.
It's a surmise. It's a surmise, but it just seems like remarkable to me that there wasn't anything more.
Well, what there is, actually, is just the crypt, because they didn't get any further with it at the time of Güell's death. But even that on its own is quite an amazing thing. There's a whole other dimension of the building which you don't get from any of the design media particularly, which is its materiality, which is also amazing. Yeah. So yeah, what exists on site is the crypt, and it's quite strange because it also they did build what would have been the sort of ramped entrance up. So the entrance into the crypt also has this sort of strange. So it's a sort of strange like ramp to nowhere.
The porch of the crypt church is the ramp to enter the main body of the church. In I think the early 2000s, it was turned from like the ruin of a building site. They kind of flattened off the top and did some sort of nods towards where the columns would have gone and things.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, actually, I wanted to go back to one thing before we miss it completely from before, which is that we also have these drawings of the interior.
It looks.
It's less columnar than Sagrada Familia. It's a bit like if you took Hagia Sophia and you did a 1D scale vertically.
Up a bit, yeah.
And put lots of Gaudí sort of stuff in it, you'd be getting something like that. But you really can't tell from these drawings.
There's a lot of magical light kind of washing down over undulating surfaces. But it's, it's really... What he shows in both of them is a very strong axial relationship between where the drawing is taken from and the altar, being drawn towards the magical location of holiness.
So normally when we've got one of these heroic lost projects, like why did you normally have some idea what it would have been like.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got more information here than we've got for like Pliny's villas, but
yeah.
It's very hard. There are big unanswered questions, but we can sort of talk about them when we talk about what is there, because what is there is super cool.
So there's this sort of strange ramp porch, and then
it's got like funny legs. I mean, there's actually only 4 columns, but they're all very curious in the way they work. And actually, it's more than 4 because there's that whole thing that goes in underneath.
Yeah,
like the plan is making it look like there's 4. There's 7 or 8. Where even to begin? There's so many different materials.
Yeah. So the church is the crypt is kind of vaguely, it's kind of vaguely circular, and there's a sort of altar on one side of so that the columns are kind of circling around. There's a kind of outer ring and an inner ring.
I mean, vaguely circular though is not doing it much justice.
No. Well, you've got to start somewhere.
It looks like a scanning electron microscope image of a microscopic louse or something. It's kind of
crab shell or something.
Yeah, funny like spider crab shell with lots of points.
Yeah.
Some points the wall is sawtooth. Some points the wall is like wobbly wibbly, like it's been drawn by someone with a very tremulous hand. Which is and this is a precise drawing of it as existing.
Yeah, and the walls are masonry. They're made from burnt brick,
I mean, that's the lecture said it was made from burnt brick, but looking at the pictures, it's made from everything.
Yeah,
there's
lots
stone, there's terracotta tiles, just like stuck in the wall.
But the main ingredient are these like failed bricks.
I think there might be like 50% of it, but there's whole patches with none of them. It has bits which are like, if you go around old villages and things, you'll see bits where where the wall has been patched up so many times, and it's got kind of inserted different bits of masonry. but it's all kind of blackened mostly, except there's some terracotta in there as well, little bits.
I think that they're mostly found materials, or in a sense that they're scavenged up from probably various bits of the Güell industrial concerns. You know, I mean, the significance of these kinds of bricks is that they're the like reject bricks. They're the ones that
they're like really
unsellable.
vitrified, so they're like going. They got too hot and they're going black. They're forming glass, I guess. And they're like very rough shapes. Yeah. But they're also made
kind of distorted as well.
Rougher by some of them like sticking out the wall. Yeah. And then there's lots of stone in there, pieces of stone. Yeah. Which also make it so it's quite black, quite dark, with very uneven. There's no courses, or the order of the courses breaks down very quickly. And so it's super like a pile of shale. It feels like it's what it's got, you know, like a shaly face. Yeah,
the exterior it's kind of undulating.
The wall is never straight. Every point is curving, and none of it's never vertical. Yeah, and it's never straight.
Yeah, and then it has punched into it these openings, which are all different, kind of either teardrop or eye-shaped window openings.
They don't have things like architraves and stuff, but the wall tends to become thicker at the top, and then they sort of have stone dressing around the top, but which is also very kind of rough, which kind of goes around, so it feels like the very top and the bottom of your eyelid as it meets your eyeball. Yeah, and then inserted into that, then there's a kind of screen of a lattice of metal in a kind of hexagonal pattern, which is made of these kind of old nails, like long, thin nails, which are some parts of a cloth-making machine being reused. And then behind that, there are these stained glass windows, which have kind of two orders of frame, one of which is this kind of like loops, and then the leads to set them in. Yeah. Which sometimes have rather complicated ways of opening. Some kind of like have these sort of butterfly patterns that like twist, and others don't.
And then on the inside, there are these amazing columns which are holding up the roof.
How many kinds of columns are there in this building? I think there's like 5.
Yeah, so there are these like rough-hewn stone columns.
Well, the stone columns here are fingers of basalt, which can form hexagonal columns. So you'll see in places where you've got this kind of eroded form of volcanic sites, you'll see these like stacks and stacks of hexagons which can kind of bend and twist on a mountain. And then they've taken out chunks of that at kind of 2 scales. Yeah. So they've got big ones and smaller ones. And the smaller ones make the shaft of the column, and the bigger ones are put in as the capital and the base. Yeah. And are then kind of hacked away at to kind of make it join. And then at points, the kind of joint has also been kind of eroded away to make it thinner. And I think they're set with lead. So it's like lumps. So they've like poured lead on the top surface and put the next stone on. And then carved them in situ. Yeah. These kind of pieces of living basalt. But there are also like another 4 kinds of columns.
Yeah. Well,
those are the high prestige columns on the inside of the crypt. Yeah.
Yeah. There are at least two kinds of sort of branching ones in the actual porch.
The sort of
itself.
Square E section brick. Yeah. Ones which can be like straight or divide. There's ones that twist as they go up. Yeah. There's ones made of kind of round bricks, which kind of are like corn cobs. Yeah. And then they kind of become this thing where it's rendered, which feels like kind of muscle sinews or something, which a mixture of like straight lines and double ruled surfaces. Yeah. And then between the ribs there is Catalan vaulting. Yeah. Which has got quite broad areas in the porch, which kind of hangs like sheets, which then has brightly coloured kind of patterns and religious motifs following the kind of lines, the ruling lines. And then the roof of the inside is made of this like very fine ribs, like we saw at the roof space of Casa Mila, but much more tightly, and it feels like the underside of bird's rib cage or something.
Yeah, very deep, so that the kind of gaps between them are lost in shadow. It's quite something.
Yeah, there are more complications and permutations. There are also columns within the walls, and there's a lot of designed objects and designed things in this space as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's strange because the language feels like we've seen this like tough structural space again in Güell, like the basement zone.
Yeah.
But here it's had applied to it the logic of a completely different. Yeah, this is very much not drawing board logic.
Yeah.
It's strings and wire logic form generation.
Yeah. This building would have been hard enough to build, and then there's also the aspiration to do it seemingly entirely with the strangest and most kind of heterogeneous group of found materials that you could imagine. Kind of about as awkward sorts of things to work with, So,
well, I mean, inside, like, they're using proper bricks and like proper tiles, and like neatly made things.
Yeah, well, it's quite. I mean, he did love to noodle. He had a lot of energy for designing. He didn't get bored of it.
This feels like the closest thing we have to a actual late Gaudí project.
Yeah.
To the like full mature style. And if he got to build it, it would have been his opportunity to show if he could actually do it or not.
Yeah. It would have been amazing, the upper bit, because I think that if you imagine these sort of masonry surfaces kind of going up and up and up and having all of these
I wasn't sure
openings and things. Do you think it would have...
If the inside would be like the inside of a shell, like, satiny and clean.
Yeah.
Intuitively, I would feel that the inside would be more polished.
Yeah.
And you'd have it would be like a big seashell.
Yeah, and the outside would have kept this kind of roughness, maybe.
Yeah, but we've got no way of knowing. That's a surmise as well. He had a great interest in kind of found form as well as found materials. This project is super about getting out of like human industrial design building into sticks, stones, shells, landforms, string to make something really different and new.
A kind of primal contact with the material world. And also, I think, a kind of freighted with like a little bit of a sense of the like pathos of abandoned things, or the this sense of the like extremely, the kind of almost worthless sort of offering.
What, the widow's penny or whatever it is?
I
can't remember what it's called.
Yeah. The design method is this mix of incredibly complex simulation and making it up as you go along.
Yeah.
And like improvising bricolage, basically. Like, it's the kind of meeting of the most abstract and kind of simulated and the most like improvisational.
Very labour intensive to make this.
Yeah.
There must have just been an unending amount of setting out. And I mean, to me, it seems like there's plenty of structure, as in there's plenty of headroom to support these things. Like, I look at that ceiling and it looks like it's got more than enough strength to support the floor. Because I can't believe these structural calculations are like super refined, especially when you consider how it's actually being made. Like, we've had various people point out us being loose with our usage of parabola and catenary.
Yeah.
And that's very valid because those things have quite specific meanings. But if it's the curve for, the archway of a corridor you're walking down, the best fit difference between a like 3 meter tall, 1 meter wide parabola and a catenary is within the incredibly wide tolerance that these buildings are made to. Or maybe it's not, but it's quite small. I don't believe this is being built to
millimeter tolerance.
Yeah, even like, I mean, this feels very much centimeter tolerance. Is especially as it's being measured. How precisely can you measure a big hanging model made of string,
which is going to move every time you try to touch it?
Moves every time you touch it.
Yeah, not very.
You can probably measure it to a couple of mil, really.
Yeah, once you get good at it.
If you were extremely good at it, which is a few centimeters.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of centimeters.
Yeah. It's an amazing project. It's this sort of fragment of a completely different
I think it's one of the most extraordinary extraordinarily unusual. I mean, this is essentially unique.
Yeah.
There isn't another thing like it.
Yeah.
Like, there've been ideas that have been like bits of it. I can't think of anyone who's built anything like this ever.
Yeah, I guess it's the fact, like, there are lots of people who seem to be reaching towards, at this time, a similar sort of dream of this organic, spiritually infused, heavenly fantasy architecture. But it's the way that he kind of carries it, both the materiality and the kind of the sort of the finesse of the structural design are just like on a completely different level from anything else that anyone's doing. And to get
the
all
nearest
of
things
that,
I can think of are like the German expressionist projects from
like
a similar sort of time.
It seems like, you know, like the Polzig Schauspielhaus or something seems like it has a similar kind of aspiration as an interior, but actually that's a lot of interior decoration being applied to something quite pragmatic. It's not at all the same thing.
No, I mean, that would fit in like with other Gaudi projects, which are less ambitious.
Yeah. Right, so shall we talk about the Sagrada Familia?
Yes. How much have you recorded for?
Hang on. Yes. So it turns out that we haven't got as far as the Sagrada Familia. We're going to wrap things up there and do that as a separate one in just a minute for us, but you'll probably encounter it as a whole different episode, one level lower on your podcast.
But hopefully it should be not too big a gap because we've got it all recorded nicely. Ha ha ha! We shall see about that.
Yeah.
Do you want to do it like? Oh, it feels like such a momentous moment. Like I feel like for me, the whole of Gaudi is building up to this church which doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Like hardly anyone goes to.
Well, no, I think probably quite a lot of people do, but it's definitely it's a bit less conveniently located than the core Gaudi itinerary. It's hard to express just what's so kind of amazing about it.
And the other thing is, he's been building up through a series of, I think the work on the Park Well is very important because there he's really developing this incredibly rough materials.
Yeah.
You know, in the columns and details. And we're also getting these columns in the kind of retaining walls that come out like fingers.
Yeah.
Which feel like they've been taken and like raised like a whole order of complexity in this project. But we're starting to see these like very rough broken stones, strange, like the columns with kind of rocks on top.
Yeah.
Feels like it's really reaching to something curious. And then he spends all this time developing this kind of model, which I think is partly about form finding. And he spent all of this time also doing these kind of vaults, you know, with lots of spandrels or whatever ribs, whatever you call them, in other projects. And they've kind of been brought to a real intensity. And it's like everything's come to this intense point, and it's like gets really ill, and then Güell dies, and everything is turned off. Like you can't finish these projects. The only thing he can work on is the Sagrada Familia, which does get some money, so he can build a bit of it. And it's a fascinating project that we'll talk about in the next episode. It's not the like teleological end of Gaudi. The teleological end of Gaudi is what would have happened if he'd finished these projects, I think. Yeah. This project in particular. It's not that the Sagrada Familia isn't important. It's just that he's been working on it for 40 years, and it's got 40 years of different things.
Technical debt. It has like a late 19th century Gothic plan, which it still has.
And it has a whole load of other things going on that we'll talk about. Not talk about now. But in a way, there's a different universe. There's a parallel universe where this is the end of the podcast series, and it would be us talking about... The next episode will be us talking about how cool or not, how much of a success or missed opportunity the finishing of this like final end state would have been. And I want to put that as, or unless you have,
I think that's that's a great way to end. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
What a treat.
Yeah.
I mean, this podcast, by the way, is also, I'm going to point out that the people who are patrons for this podcast make it exist.
Yeah.
And I'm very thankful to them
for
that, because it's something that's really nice in my life.
Yeah.
And so thank you especially.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of the listeners.
Yeah.
I appreciate. The other thing that makes it possible is that people listen to it, which makes me that we think we feel guilty. Oh,
we're
not putting it
do another one.
Out. We feel very guilty.
Yeah.
But then another group of you are going extra far and making it possible as well. So thank you all.
Yes. Well, if you are listening to this podcast, but you, for some reason, are not subscribed or don't know...
Well, many people will have good reasons they're not subscribed, and that's completely fine as well.
Oh, I mean, like, on their podcast.
Oh, on their podcast player.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty silly, isn't it? Well, perhaps they don't like us.
Or if you aren't following our social media platforms where we post images, or any of that kind of... If any of that kind of thing is of interest, or if you do actually want to support the podcast in a financial capacity, the links to all of those are on our website, aboutbuildingsandcities.org. But thank you very much.
And if you like us, leave a review somewhere. We don't get very many reviews these days, but we appreciate them a great deal, and it's nice to read them.
All right. Well, until next time. Bye-bye.
Good night.